Today we're going to break down one of the most important teaching procedures in applied behavior analysis, which is Discrete Trial Training, or DTT. At its core, DTT follows a very specific structure: a discriminative stimulus, followed by a learner response, followed by a consequence, and then a brief pause before the next trial. What makes DTT so powerful is that each trial has a clear beginning and a clear end, which allows us to measure learning precisely. This is not just a clinical tool, but also a very high-frequency exam topic, so understanding the structure is essential. DTT matters because it is considered a core instructional method in ABA and forms the foundation of many teaching procedures. It is widely used across clinical settings, and on the exam, it is often tested through detailed scenarios that require you to identify whether the procedure is implemented correctly. What the exam is really testing is procedural accuracy, meaning whether each step occurs in the correct order. Even small errors in sequence can make an answer incorrect, so precision is critical. Discrete trial training is defined as a structured teaching format in which skills are broken down into small, teachable units and taught through repeated trials with clear beginnings and endings. The key idea here is that complex skills are divided into manageable components, and each trial represents a complete teaching opportunity. Because each trial has a defined start and end, we can collect very precise data on both inputs and outputs, which allows for accurate measurement of learning. There are several core features that define DTT. First, it is highly structured, meaning the sequence is consistent and predictable. Second, it is adult-directed, meaning the instructor controls the pace and content of instruction. Third, it involves repetitive practice, which allows the learner to build fluency through multiple trials. And finally, it includes immediate feedback, which is critical because consequences must follow responses quickly in order to strengthen learning. A single DTT trial consists of 4 essential components. First is the discriminative stimulus, or SD, which is the instruction or cue. Second is the learner's response. Third is the consequence, which provides feedback. And fourth is the intertrial interval, or ITI, which is the brief pause before the next trial. The exam often tests whether you can correctly identify and order these 4 components, so it's important to see them as a complete and repeated sequence. The discriminative stimulus, or SD, is defined as the instruction or environmental cue that signals that reinforcement is available for a specific response. It always occurs before the behavior and sets the occasion for that behavior to occur. In other words, the SD tells the learner that if they respond correctly, reinforcement will follow. This relationship between SD and behavior is foundational, and the exam often tests whether you understand that the SD must come before the response. Examples of SDs include instructions like touch red, what is this, or clap your hands. These are all clear directives that signal what response is expected. A critical requirement for an SD is that it must be clear and consistent. If the instruction changes across trials or is ambiguous, the learner may not understand what is being asked, which disrupts the teaching process. So clarity and consistency are key features of effective SD delivery. This slide highlights common SD-related exam traps. One major error is presenting a prompt before the SD, which reverses the correct sequence. Another is giving unclear or inconsistent instructions, which weakens stimulus control. A particularly important concept is that a prompt should never replace the SD. The correct sequence is always SD first. Then the learner has an opportunity to respond, and only then is a prompt provided if needed. If the prompt comes first, it can create prompt dependency. The learner response is defined as the observable and measurable behavior that occurs after the SD. It must be something that can be seen, counted, and recorded. The response can be correct or incorrect, and that distinction determines what consequence follows. Importantly, the response is the basis for evaluating whether learning is occurring, so it must be clearly defined and measurable. Examples of responses include pointing to an item, labeling an object, imitating an action, or following a direction. In each case, the response is directly tied to the SD. For example, if the SD is touch red, the response might be pointing to a red object. One important exam point is that responses must be defined clearly enough to be measured reliably. Otherwise, we cannot accurately determine whether learning has occurred. There are several common response errors. A learner may give no response, an incorrect response, or a delayed response. Another critical issue is prompt dependency, where the learner only responds when prompted. A very common exam trap is counting a prompted response as independent. In ABA, only responses that occur without prompts are considered independent and indicate true mastery. The consequence is what follows the learner's response, and it must occur immediately to be effective. Consequences serve two main functions: reinforcing correct responses and providing error correction for incorrect responses. The timing here is critical. If reinforcement is delayed, the connection between behavior and consequence weakens, which reduces learning effectiveness. There are different types of consequences used in DTT. Reinforcement strengthens correct responses. Error correction is used to teach the correct response after an error. Prompting may also be included as part of the consequence to support correct responding. And sometimes neutral feedback is provided, which gives information without reinforcement. Each of these plays a different role in shaping behavior. This slide focuses on common mistakes in consequence delivery. One of the biggest issues is delayed reinforcement, which reduces the effectiveness of learning. Another is inconsistent feedback, where the same behavior is treated differently across trials. Reinforcing incorrect responses is another major error, as it strengthens the wrong behavior. And finally, weak reinforcers may fail to motivate the learner. The key principle is that immediate and consistent reinforcement strengthens learning. Now let's talk about the intertrial interval, or ITI, which is often underestimated but actually very important for maintaining the structure of DTT. The ITI is defined as the brief pause between consecutive trials, and its main purpose is to separate one learning opportunity from the next. Without this pause, trials can start to blend together, and the learner may not clearly discriminate when one trial ends and the next begins. Functionally, the ITI helps preserve clear trial boundaries, which is critical for both learning and data collection. It also allows the learner a moment to reset before the next instruction, which supports attention and reduces confusion. From an exam perspective, remember that the ITI always occurs after the consequence and before the next SD. If it appears in the wrong place, that is a sequencing error. Building on that, the importance of the ITI goes beyond just being a pause. It plays several key roles in maintaining instructional quality. First, it prevents overlap between trials, ensuring that each trial remains a distinct learning unit. Second, it helps maintain a consistent instructional pace, which is important for both engagement and learning efficiency. It also supports attention by giving the learner a brief moment to process what just happened before moving on. A very important exam point here is that the ITI should be brief and consistent. If it's too long, you lose instructional momentum. If it's inconsistent, it can disrupt the structure of teaching. So think of ITI not as downtime, but as part of the teaching system. Now let's put everything together into the full DTT sequence. A complete trial follows a strict and predictable order. First, the SD is presented. Second, the learner has the opportunity to respond. Third, the consequence is delivered immediately. And fourth, the ITI separates the trial before the next one begins. This sequence is not flexible. It must be followed in this exact order. The reason is that DTT is based on establishing a clear relationship between instruction, behavior, and consequence. Timing is also critical. The consequence must occur immediately after the response, otherwise the learning connection weakens. On the exam, many questions are designed to test whether you can detect small sequence violations, so always mentally check. SD first, response second, consequence third, ITI the last. This slide introduces an important teaching strategy distinction: mass practice versus distributed practice. Mass practice involves repeating the same target across consecutive trials. This is especially useful during initial skill acquisition, when the learner is just beginning to learn a new behavior and needs repeated exposure. Distributed practice, on the other hand, mixes different targets across trials. This is used for maintenance, generalization, and discrimination because it requires the learner to respond flexibly rather than repeating the same response. From an exam perspective, think of massed practice as building the skill, and distributed practice as strengthening and generalizing the skill. Prompting is a critical component in DTT and is defined as supplemental assistance provided after the SD to increase the likelihood of a correct response. The most important rule here is that prompts must always follow the SD, never come before it. The SD initiates the learning opportunity, and the prompt supports the response if needed. Prompts are used to reduce errors and help the learner contact reinforcement, but they are not meant to be permanent. Over time, prompts must be systematically faded so that the learner can respond independently. A key exam trap is placing the prompt before the SD, which changes the contingency and leads to prompt dependency. Transfer trials are where we begin to shift from prompted responding to independent responding, which is essential for true learning. The goal of a transfer trial is to reduce reliance on prompts while maintaining accuracy. This is done through a process called prompt fading, where the level of assistance is gradually decreased over time. For example, you might move from full physical prompting to partial prompting, then to gestural prompts, and eventually to no prompts at all. From an exam standpoint, independence is the key indicator of mastery. If a learner only responds when prompted, the skill has not truly been learned. Now let's connect this to how DTT appears on the BCBA exam. Most questions are scenario-based, and they often test whether you can identify errors in the trial sequence. You may be asked to label components, identify timing issues, or determine whether prompting was used correctly. The exam is not just testing definitions. It is testing your ability to analyze procedures in context. So when you see a question, break it down into components. Where is the SD? What is the response? What consequences delivered? Is the timing correct? This slide highlights the most common areas where students make mistakes. One major confusion is between the SD and a prompt. The SD initiates the response, while the prompt supports it. Another is reinforcement timing. Delayed reinforcement weakens learning. Students also often misplace the ITI or misunderstand error correction procedures. The most important takeaway here is that sequence matters. If the order changes, the teaching procedure changes. That's exactly what the exam is testing. In real-world application, DTT provides a highly structured and measurable way to teach new skills. The process typically starts with identifying a target skill, then implementing structured trials, collecting data on each response, and using that data to guide instruction. Because each trial is clearly defined, DTT allows for very precise tracking of progress and ensures consistency across teaching sessions. This is why DTT is considered a foundational teaching framework in ABA. To summarize, discrete trial training is a structured, adult-directed teaching method that relies on a consistent sequence of SD, response, consequence, and ITI. Immediate reinforcement is critical, and consistency across trials is what drives learning. If you understand the structure, the timing, and the purpose of each component, you will be able to both implement DTT effectively and answer exam questions accurately. As you prepare for the BCBA exam, focus on mastering the logic behind DTT, not just memorizing the steps. Practice identifying correct and incorrect sequences, understanding timing, and recognizing common errors. If you want to apply these concepts in exam-style questions, you can try a full mock exam at www.bcbmockexam.com. The goal is to think like a behavior analyst, not just recall information.